So, ladies and gentlemen, dear Hermann, dear Fulbright scholars, I'm happy that so many of you are here tonight. So, because this weather is unacceptable, so we are happy to see you here, and I hope the few from you enjoyed the tour through the Sigmund Freud Museum. Sigmund Freud Museum is partner of the Austrian Fulbright program since decades, and as the birthplace of psychoanalysis, also a really good place to welcome the Fulbright-Freud visiting lecturer of psychoanalysis. A quite long title. So this year we have the pleasure to welcome and to have Max Cavitch with us, who has been teaching at the university, Vienna University, at the Institute for Comparative Literature in the last 5 months. Max is Associate Professor of English at the University of Pennsylvania and faculty affiliate of Penn's program in Comparative Literature and Gender, Sexuality and Women's Studies. He is a founding faculty member and current co-director of Penn's Psychoanalytic Studies program, as well as the founding editor of the blog Psyche on Campus, winner of the 2022 Award of Excellence in Journalism from the American Psychoanalytic Association. He published dozens of scholarly articles in American and African American literature, cinema studies, poetry, poetics, and psychoanalytic studies. Among them, Psychoanalysis and the University, Resistance and Renewal from Freud to the Present, Routledge 2025. And what I really love on Max Cavitch is that he is never afraid to address the really hot and also hurting topics of our time. So his latest book, Ashes, A History of Thought and Substance, is forthcoming from Punctum Books. Based on the topic of his current research and course at the university, Animals in Mind, Psychoanalysis and Narratives of the Human-Animal Encounter, his Fulbright lecture today is entitled On and Off the Couch, the Dogs of Psychoanalysis. So thank you very much for all your commitment during the last month. We'd love to have you here, Max. And we are all very much looking forward to your lecture. And now I would like to pass over to Hermann.
Yeah, thank you. Welcome and servus, ladies and gentlemen, dear bright minds. It's great to see so many of you here today, and especially here in the Sigmund Freud Museum, which is dear to the heart also of Fulbright Austria. We are good friends since the beginning, as you mentioned. So we are celebrating 75 years of bright minds, connecting peoples, connecting nations, connecting generations, and somehow this also works together with your mission here, connecting us with Sigmund Freud's legacy and heritage. It's great that we have the opportunity as Fulbright Austria to have so good friends, partners like you. We started in 1997, so you were one of the first partners Fulbright Austria had to bring American professors, students, scholars, teaching assistants here to Austria to bring their personal piece of America into Austria. And we sent Austrian students, teaching assistants and scholars to the United States to do the same on the other side of the Atlantic. So this connection, this friendship is really dear to our heart. And talking about friends and talking about the topic of today, one of my best friends when I grew up was the dog of my grandfather. And I really remember sitting down with him, the dog, on the couch, talking hours and hours. So somehow I can relate to this special relationship to dogs. And I would like to listen now to Max, what you have to say about this story. and the dogs and sitting on the couch in relationship with Sigmund Freud. So with this, thank you for coming. Think about applying for the Fulbright program to go to the United States and bringing Austria there as a cultural ambassador. So with this, I hand it over to you, Max.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Monica, for your very kind introduction. And thanks very much to all of my friends and colleagues here at the Freud Museum who've been so gracious and welcoming over the past few months. Thank you, Herman, and all of your colleagues at the Fulbright Austria Foundation for hosting me this semester. It's been a real pleasure to be here. And I haven't seen as much of Vienna as I would have liked to because I've gotten so much work done. So thank you for that, and I'll have to come back and see more of Vienna itself, which is a very beautiful city indeed. I've spent most of my time here in Vienna working on a rather eccentric, but also, I hope, thought-provoking book that I'm calling Fido and Psyche, Dogs in and Around Psychoanalysis, 1871 to the Present, an Illustrated History. And I'd like to thank all of the rest of you for coming to the museum on this very sweltering evening to hear me talk a bit about these dogs both on and off the couch, including, of course, the world's most famous couch, the analytic couch of Sigmund Freud himself. Eva, are you here? Oh, there we go. Okay. The psychoanalytic bestiary, as you know, is full of dogs. The clinical and theoretical literature abounds in examples of canine symbolism, phobia, projection, anthropomorphism, surrogacy, and identification. Countless psychoanalysts, from Anna and Sigmund Freud to contemporary practitioners, have been devoted dog companions, and dogs have been present in innumerable psychoanalytic sessions, increasingly since the mid-20th century as acknowledged co-participants in those sessions. And dogs themselves are now being studied and even treated psychodynamically. Yet there has never been a comprehensive monograph on dogs in and around psychoanalysis. And while no single species could fully address the so-called question of the animal in psychoanalysis, there is no one species more deeply implicated in psychoanalytic history, theory, and practice than Canis familiaris. What I'd like to do is first and briefly to give you a broad sketch of this book that I'm writing, to give you a sense of what I hope to accomplish when it's finished. And then I'll use the remainder of my time to be your guide through an illustrated history of the relationships that psychoanalysts have had with their own dogs. And I'll be concentrating chiefly on Freud's family and circle, since after all, we're in his home. But also, much more briefly, extend that history up to the present and conclude with some very brief remarks on the significance of this history. Following a short introduction, my book's first chapter, called Dogs in Mind, is about the various ways in which dogs populate not only our habitable world, but also our psyches. We keep dogs in mind as symbols, as internal objects, as idealized best friends, as stand-ins for abjected or demonized others, and as representatives of both the human and the non-human. This chapter also discusses a number of psychoanalytic case histories in which dogs play major roles in lived experience, psychopathology, and psychoanalytic treatment. Because so many psychoanalysts themselves have shared their lives with dogs, the book's second chapter, Psychoanalysts and Their Dogs, reconstructs dozens of these important relationships, from the Freuds and their many dogs up to the present day. And because these relationships have from the start slipped into treatment settings, the book's third chapter explores the various roles played by dogs in the consulting room, where they have been both accidental and intended presences. The fourth chapter, Dog-Assisted Psychotherapies and the Interspecies Third, traces the systematization and theorization, beginning in the mid-20th century, of clinical recognition and legitimation of dogs as co-participants in the psychotherapeutic treatment of human patients. My book's fifth and final chapter, Dogs on the Couch, shifts the focus of attention from humans' relationships with dogs to dogs' emergence as psychoanalytic subjects in their own right. I begin with the history and iconic significance of the couch itself as a piece of furniture associated since the 18th century with shifting values of domesticity, comfort, privacy, and intimacy, as a key fixture in the 19th century's medicalization of comfort, as the centerpiece of Freud's professional life, from his pre-psychoanalytic medical practice of hypnosis, massage, and electrotherapy, to the reconstruction in exile of his office at 20 Maresfield Gardens in London, as a universal, if increasingly anachronistic, symbol of psychoanalysis, and crucially as a perennially contested seat, as it were, of human-canine identification. This background helps me then to elaborate upon the ways in which psychoanalysis, from Freud's own casual speculations on the dreams of non-human animals to later increasingly serious and systematic efforts to understand and even treat non-human psychopathologies, has been making a place on the couch, so to speak, for dogs, acknowledging, studying, and even treating dogs psychodynamically. Ultimately, by drawing on the latest findings of affective neuroscience and recent theorizations of the analytic third, this chapter will argue the need for greatly expanded psychoanalytic attention to canine consciousness and to dogs' own complex experience of canine-human intersubjectivity. The fact that dogs engage in symbolic interactions with their human companions has been known to every dog-keeping psychoanalyst since Sigmund Freud himself. Yet it wasn't until quite late in life that Freud became a dog person. In fact, when he was in his late 50s, his friend and colleague Lou Andreas Salome observed that, quote, he did not care much for cats or dogs or animals generally, unquote. But in his 7th decade, Freud started making up for lost time. First, he fell in love with Wolf, the black Alsatian he had given to his daughter Anna in early June 1925. Anna had insisted on having a male dog, telling Andreas Salome, I prefer the males incomparably more. She also wanted a dog big enough to protect her on the summer walks she liked to take without human companionship in the summery. But however much she might have preferred to be alone with her dog, Wolf quickly became someone she had to share with her father, and indeed with the entire family and their social circle. Writing to Andreas Salome in July 1925, Anna Freud reveals the beginnings of what would continue to be a mostly good-natured emotional tug-of-war between father and daughter over Wolf's affection. And she writes to Andreas Salome, Wolf has already become a well-recognized housemate. Everyone likes him, especially Papa. He's friendly towards the others as well, but of course not nearly as friendly as he is with me. He hardly ever leaves me, and if I'm out of his sight for so much as 5 minutes, he goes wild at our reunion, unquote. Both Anna and her father were entranced by Wolf and treated the dog like a child, spoiling him and making Martha, Sigmund's wife, furious by feeding him scraps at her meticulous table. And it was precisely by treating Wolf like a child that Freud was able to redirect toward the dog some of the deep affection he'd felt for his recently deceased grandson, whose death from tuberculosis in 1923 had broken Freud's heart. In a letter to Jean Lampel de Groot's, Freud wrote feelingly of Wolf, who, he said, quote, almost replaces the lost Heinerle for me, unquote. In fact, Wolf became a kind of surrogate child for both Sigmund and Anna, and their love for him, inflected as it was with more than a little competitiveness, made for a kind of interspecies Oedipal triangle, with many of the accompanying intensities of jealousy, identification, longing, projection, and resentment. By midsummer of that first year, 1925, Wolf had also was becoming known to more and more people in the Freud circle. In a letter to Carl Abraham, Sigmund Freud effused about their, quote, adventures with Wolf, who with his passionate affection and jealousy, his mistrust of strangers, and his mingling of wildness and docility has become the focus of everyone's interest. Over the ensuing years, complex human-canine circuits of projection, displacement, jealousy, identification, infantilism, mourning, and love encompass and enhance the Freud's relationships with dog-devoted friends and patients. I'm sorry, the microphone is misbehaving. Okay, yeah. Okay, so Wolf was becoming the object of everyone's interest. Over the ensuing years, I've read that sentence already, I'll skip ahead to name just a few of the people who got to know and love and compete for Wolf's affection with the Freuds themselves. They included Andreas Salome, of course, Dorothy Burlingham, Ernest Jones, Eva Rosenfeld, Hilda Doolittle, Arnold Zweig, Marie Bonaparte, and many more. And these doggy dynamics were compounded as Freud's initially one-dog household grew over the years into a canine menagerie. Oh, I'm sorry, wrong. But for the first 3 years of his life at Berggasse 19, Anna's Wolf was their one and only dog. He was a regular feature in the Freud's epistolary exchanges of news and endearments with various correspondents. For example, in a letter to Sigmund Freud in September of 1925, Andreas Salome asks him to please scratch the inside of Wolf's ears for me, and goes on in this letter to confess, quote, that I already begin to be a bit unfaithful to him with Racher, Eva Rosenfeld's little ruffian of a dachshund, even though he just made off with half a dish of meat from the table without showing the slightest sign of ethical distress. Moreover, he received no punishment. What does the far more civilized Wolf have to say about that? Unquote. The many weighty themes woven into this brief and jocular passage, physical intimacy, infidelity, instinctual life, and the operations of conscience and civility, all testify to the importance of Wolf's role as a kind of transitional object, helping as a much-loved extension or symbol of Sigmund Freud himself to sustain and enhance a sense of secure and affectionate attachment between Freud and his human correspondents as well. In addition to being far more civilized, Wolf also displayed, or was at least rumored to display, greater intelligence and moral discrimination than most dogs. In his reminiscence of life at Berggasse 19, Freud's grandson Ernst wrote, quote, "Their German shepherd Jofi was very intelligent. He was accustomed to visiting the Prater with us in open taxis, and when he got lost there once, he jumped into a taxi, let the taxi driver read the address on his collar, and was promptly delivered to Berggasse." The story of Wolf's taxi ride became the stuff of canine legend, circulated and preserved in various forms, not only by the Freuds and their circles, but also in the international press. Headlines featured the canine from Vienna to Milwaukee. And while this anecdote might well have some basis in fact, the story that ran, for example, in the Milwaukee Journal, this is Milwaukee, Wisconsin in the American Midwest, demonstrates the kinds of distortions to which it could also be subjected, reporting that Sigmund, not Anna's dog, was a beautiful Chow, not an Alsatian, who would leave the doctor's house every morning and wander the streets of Vienna. Invariably, by the end of the day, she, they get the gender wrong as well, would be hopelessly lost. But that did not cause her to become panicky. She would proceed calmly to the nearest taxi stand, raise her head to reveal the identification tag around her neck, and have herself driven home. Dr. Freud was always good for the fare, unquote. As a more factually consistent and plausible, though not definitively verifiable, account appears in the unpublished memoir of Freud's grandson, Harry, who tells it this way. One day, Anna and Wolf were on a walk when they came upon soldiers shooting blank rounds into the air. The noise startled Wolf, who ran away and leapt into a taxicab just as the door opened, probably to admit another passenger. According to the driver, Wolf kept lifting his head and leaning towards the driver until the man realized that the dog's address was written on the collar. Wolf got a taxi ride home, and the driver scored a large tip from Herr Freud. As a modern animal fable, this tale speaks to many of the ways in which anthropomorphism may work in and through the human psyche. For example, as a way of managing or obviating human difficulties in perceiving and tolerating non-human otherness, as a way of validating the human disposition to understand and relate to the world in human terms, and as a defensive insistence on harmony between the human and the non-human. But harmonious human-canine relations, even with so civilized a dog as the taxi-riding wolf, weren't easily achieved by all of the visitors to Berggasse 19. Indeed, in 1927, Freud's biographer, Ernest Jones, was traumatized by its new canine resident, as he relates in his autobiography, beginning with an account of the origin of his own childhood phobia. And this is Jones writing. "I suffered considerably from night terrors in childhood, but the only conscious phobia I developed was of wolves, who might at night descend on me from the nearby woods. It was no doubt a projection onto my innocent father of some oral sadistic fantasies, perhaps given some point by a habit he had of playfully snapping at us when we tugged his mustache. It left an echo in a permanent dislike of wolf-like dogs, particularly Alsatians, which contrasted with the fondness I have always had for most other breeds," end quote. Jones's fondness for non-wolf-like dogs finds confirmation in his son, Mervyn Jones' autobiography, in which Mervyn writes, quote, "There have always been dogs in the Jones family," as well as in his own expression of concern for Trutty, the dog of his first serious romantic partner, Loie Kahn. That's Ernest's first romantic partner. But unluckily for Jones, Anna Freud's dog was, as she herself put it, a large, not undangerous Alsatian. And this particular wolf was all too ready to confirm Jones' hitherto groundless fears. And this is Jones continuing the story of his encounter with Wolf. He flew at me and tore at a piece of my thigh. Freud, who was present, sagely remarked on how dogs instinctively recognize those who dislike them or who are afraid of them, and at once treat them as enemies, unquote. Freud says he punished Wolf, though not how exactly, for biting Jones. But he later told his friend Max Eidingen, quote, "I really hated to do it," that is, punish Wolf, "because he, Jones, deserved it," unquote. Indeed, Freud seems sincerely to have believed that all dogs had a distinctively canine ability to assess human character. Anna Freud later recalled him saying, quote, "Dogs love their friends and bite their enemies, in contrast to men who are incapable of pure love and must at all times mix love and hate in their object relations," unquote. The complexity of human object relations was made manifest in Anna Freud's gift to her father on his 70th birthday, May 6, 1926, his first birthday since Wolf had joined the family. In anticipation of this special birthday, Andreas Salome wrote to Freud, quote, "What does Wolf say about your birthday, which he has never before helped to celebrate? Shouldn't he have half a salami for his supper? He actually deserves the nickname that the Russians have for the Germans, sausage eaters. Although surely after his brief exile, he will have become even more human-like, while retaining, naturally, all of his canine beauty," unquote. Freud answers back about a week later, doing his best to satisfy her curiosity about Wolf's perspective. Quote, "I can answer your kind inquiry about Wolf with the news that he passed these days of celebration in animal innocence. Shortly beforehand, he hadn't been well, and we took advantage of this to send him for the holidays to his former master's sanatorium, from which he has now returned, recovered, but unsuspecting." Anna had already had a photograph taken of him, and she affixed it to a poem she'd written on his behalf, in which, though absent and unaware, he congratulated me, unquote. Anna Freud explained to Andreas Salome, quote, "I didn't give him anything for his birthday," meaning her father. "Just a photo of Wolf, made as a joke, because I always insist that he has transferred his entire interest in me onto Wolf." That is, her father had transferred all of his interest in her into Wolf. Her phrase, "just a photo," is a bit disingenuous, as this particular portrait was taken by the highly celebrated fashion and society photographer Dora Kalmus, whose human subjects included Coco Chanel, Alban Berg, Colette, and Josephine Baker. Freud said he was very pleased with it. Indeed, so pleased was he with this framed photograph of Wolf and the accompanying poem that it remained hanging on one of the bookcases in his study throughout Wolf's life and even after the dog's death in 1936. That is, until the family was forced to flee Vienna in 1938. And there are several photographs of the interior of Berggasse 19 taken shortly before their flight that clearly show the cherished picture of Wolf in place. With this 1926 birthday poem, a family tradition was inaugurated, and each year for the rest of Freud's life, he received a birthday poem ostensibly written and often signed by one or more of the Freud's dogs, but always penned for them, in fact, by Anna. Sigmund continued to dote on and identify with Anna's dog, an identification observed and even encouraged by their friends. For example, Freud told Ferenczi in 1926 that Dorothy Burlingham, quote, is very supportive of us and insists on taking me and Wolf out for a drive every morning, unquote. And in a 1929 letter to Andreas Salome, written while Anna was away in England, delivering a lecture at Oxford, I believe, Freud complained of her absence on behalf of both himself and Wolf. Quote, like Wolf, I could hardly wait for her return. I write, and he spends half the day lying listlessly on his bed, unquote. Many years later, in 1935, anticipating another visit from Ernest Jones, Freud advised him that he and Wolf were growing old together, and therefore that, quote, the prospect of your visit to Vienna at Easter makes me feel glad as well as wistful. As a result of the restrictions of old age, I know that I will be able to meet my obligations as host only very inadequately. Our Wolf, too, who once behaved in such an unfriendly manner towards you, is now an old gentleman, and as old as I am in his canine context, that is, over 11 years old. Yet Wolf was by no means the only dog in Freud's life by then. Their close family friend and Anna's life partner, Dorothy Burlingham, herself was the proud companion of a gray Bedlington Terrier and saw how infatuated with Wolf Freud had become, and she decided that he needed a dog of his own. In 1928, she presented him with a Chow named Lün II, to which Freud quickly became very devoted. And all was well until the following August, when their family friend and a future psychoanalyst herself, Eva Rosenfeld, was escorting Lün from Berchtesgaden to Vienna, and the dog broke free in the station at Salzburg. The dog was found dead 3 days later, having been run over by a train on the line. Freud was grief-stricken, telling Max Eidingen, quote, we're all devastated at the loss of our dear Lün. In its quality, if not its intensity, it's like the pain of losing a child, unquote. Anna Freud explained the loss to Rosenfeld in similar terms, quote, you know our ways. We take little Lün as seriously in death as we did in life, even giving her the right to be mourned, although she may not be entitled to it. What hurts me so is that I could not bring her back to Papa in spite of all the searching for her. And then she suddenly turned into many others for me, into Sophie as my sister and Papa's little daughter, and into Heinerle because he also gave him such joy. But perhaps we can replace her for Papa after a while. You mustn't feel too bad, Eva. Your intentions were good, and all you wanted to do was to put yourself there for us. It could have happened to any of us. Somehow my heart aches for her, but I try hard to make it pass, unquote. A few months later, the family did in fact replace her. First, with a very short-lived dog named Ada, we believe, whose death Freud tersely noted on December 30th. But then, on March 9th of the following year, just a few months later, Burlingham presented Freud with 2 Chows. These, one of which was Lün Yu's sister, the dog Jofi, or Jofi, and Lün Yu II. Jofi, who remained Freud's bosom companion until her death in 1937, remains the best known of Freud's dogs, and many photographs and home movies of them together survive in the archives. Lün II, however, was unable to get along with Jofi and was consequently given to Helene and Felix Deutsch, but will make a reappearance later in our story. Freud and Jofi quickly formed a strong attachment, even as he continued to mourn Lün II. Writing to Andreas Salome 2 months after Jofi's arrival, Freud called her, quote, a delightful creature, so interesting, and like a woman, wild, impulsive, affectionate, and intelligent, yet not so dependent as some other dogs can be. One cannot help feeling respect for such beings, unquote. Moreover, Freud's love for Jofi seemed to enhance rather than displace his bond with Wolf. Asked by Andreas Salome about his summer work plans, for example, Freud replied that he wanted to, quote, go walking in some beautiful forest with Anna, Wolf, and my new Jofi. And Anna, too, loved both of the dogs. Jofi ended up having 2 litters. From the first litter, delivered in February 1931, just one puppy named Tattoon survived, and only briefly, dying of distemper in October of that year. Jofi ate part of her second litter, sadly, which was delivered, the second litter was delivered in April 1933. One of the surviving puppies of that litter, which she didn't eat, and which had been intended for Hilda Doolittle's partner, the novelist Breyer, bit someone and had to be put down. It's a very unfortunate litter. But 2 other puppies from this otherwise unfortunate litter survived. Tattoon, named after his predecessor, and Foe, named after an artifact in Freud's collection, the stone Dog of Foe he received on his birthday in 1934, which is not really a dog but a lion, but there you are. Freud's enormous collection of antiquities included many other canine figures, some of which he showed to Hilda Doolittle, who was a patient of his, of course, as well as a friend, and who, in her wonderful narrative of her time with Freud, described them with much hilarity in a letter written initially to her partner Breyer. Doolittle wrote, quote, he keeps bringing out the most lovely old tanagras and archaic Greek and Egyptian statuettes. He showed me a Coptic clay dog that is just like Jofi, that someone had bought for him in Berlin, some adoring analysand, obviously. And he was struck with the likeness to his own dog. So evidently, Jofi or Fio is one of the regular features. The clay dog was amazingly like Fio or Jofi, the same color too. I suppose Papa Freud has to have a female dog, as he is so very, very normal. I said the unusual Egyptian statue of the dog was long and thin, and off he rushed to the other room, dragging out a wooden old Egyptian dog to show me. This is obviously a figure of Anubis, the dog-headed Greek god of death. Terribly Fido Rover world, unquote. Doolittle visited the Freuds also at the summer house that they rented in 1933 and wrote to Breyer about the dogs there. Quote, Wolf barked the place down, and he is really very handsome in the open. There is the other little dog, a sort of stepdaughter by divorce to Jofi, a daughter of one of her former husbands. It is very pretty and friendly to me. The little dogs are having a pen put up and arrive in a few days. The maid was in ecstasy. This is Paula Fichtel, of course. They had been to call. She said they were little lions, these many Chow puppies, some of which would be given to various friends and patients in due course. Hoa Varta, the name of the summer home they rented, is very exotic now and more friendly with the hounds, running in and out and jumping on the analysis couch to lick one all over, unquote. The Freuds summered regularly at Hoa Varta, and at least one correspondent imagined the dogs looked forward to it as much as the human members of the family. In a letter dated 2 days before Freud's 76th birthday in 1932, Andreas Salome expressed the wish that it found him already at your summer residence. No doubt you've been longing to go there, and the two dogs surely think of winter as a mere period of exile from the place. While at Hoa Varta the following summer, the noted photographer, another noted photographer, Hans Casparius, took a much publicized photograph of Freud with the two puppies, Faux and Tatoon, on the balcony. Oh, whoops, so there's the photo. This photograph was reproduced in several periodicals over the next few years, including in a special issue of the periodical Die Bühne in May 1935, which was published in conjunction with a large dog show in Vienna, and the following May on the front cover of the illustrated weekly Wiener Bilder. The apparent fondness with which this image was circulated in the Viennese press made it easy to forget that when the picture was taken in the summer of 1933, it had already been a very sad and ominous year. Indeed, in April, shortly before the family left for Hoa Varta, Anna had written to Jones, quote, "Sometimes I am amazed that in such times as the present spring and summer I'm amazed that in such times as the present spring and summer, what's going on with this sentence? I'm amazed that such times as the present spring and summer come as if nothing had happened." These translations are my own, so there are bound to be a few errors here and there. Sorry about that. I have the original German text if you'd like the correct versions. In January, of course, Hitler had been named as Germany's new chancellor. In suspension of civil rights, paving the way for the authoritarian regime to come. In March, Hitler had been elected Reichskanzler, and the Nazi party swept into power, quickly transforming Germany into a one-party authoritarian state. And in Freud's birth month of May, Nazi-inspired student groups across Germany were staging book burnings, the largest of which took place in Berlin, where propaganda minister Goebbels inaugurated the bonfire by proclaiming, quote, that the era of extreme Jewish intellectualism is now at an end, unquote. Among the many works targeted were those of German-language Jewish authors, as you know, including Max Brod, Eta Federn, Heinrich Heine, Franz Kafka, Siegfried Krakauer, Rosa Luxemburg, Franz Werfel, Stefan Zweig, and of course Freud himself. Meanwhile, in April, Freud's sons Oliver and Ernst, who'd been living in Berlin, emigrated with their families to France and England, respectively. And as Austria's own fascist powers surged that spring, many of Freud's friends begged him to leave as well, before it became too late. It was also around this time that Austria's Vaterländische Front was established, and in less than a year, it turned this country too, into a one-party authoritarian state. And it was under these circumstances that Sigmund Freud began writing the book that would occupy him most persistently, most vexingly, I guess it's better to say, for the rest of his life, and this is, of course, Moses and monotheism. Freud's obsession with the figure of Moses was of long standing and powerfully linked to yet another piece of statuary, though not one in his own magnificent collection. And this is, of course, the Moses of Michelangelo from the tomb of Pope Julius II in Rome. Freud saw this statue on his very first visit to Rome in 1901. And as he put it, he never ceased to find it baffling and splendid. And he visited sometimes on a daily basis on all of his many trips to that city. In 1914, he published a short essay called The Moses of Michelangelo, in which he effuses, quote, "No piece of statuary has ever made a stronger impression on me than this. How often have I mounted the steep steps of the unlovely Corso Cavour to the lonely piazza where the deserted church stands, and have essayed to support the angry scorn of the hero's glance. Sometimes I have crept cautiously out of the half-gloom of the interior as though I myself belonged to the mob upon whom his eye is turned, the mob which can hold fast no conviction, which has neither faith nor patience, and which rejoices when it has regained its illusory idols. But why do I call this statue inscrutable? There is not the slightest doubt that it represents Moses, the lawgiver of the Jews, holding the tablets of the Ten Commandments. That much is certain, but that is all," unquote. Anyone who has been to the Piazza di San Pietro in Vincoli at an odd hour of the evening or morning might be reminded by this passage of the stray dogs, the many stray dogs, who then, as now, mount the steep steps of the Via Cavour and creep cautiously around the basilica, doing their best to support the angry scorn of the glances of shopkeepers and street cleaners as they poke around among the inscrutable statues and monuments for the discarded scraps that might help these strays of Monti eke out their lives. Freud was, of course, well aware that the image of the Jewish dog had been a pervasive metaphor of degradation ever since the time of Christ. He was also likely aware, I'm being slow with the slides. There are the dogs of Monti. Monti is the neighborhood of Rome in which the Basilica of San Pietro is located. Freud was also likely aware, as he roamed the palimpsestic streets of ancient, medieval, and modern Rome in the early 20th century, of the contemporary Pope Pius IX's recent expression of concern that the 1870 liberation of Rome's Jewish ghetto would allow Jews, quote, "to wander about like dogs and befoul the streets of Rome," unquote. By the time Freud was working on his Moses book, the fascists of Germany and Austria were making ample use of this perennial Christian insult. In Freud's Vienna, for example, during the Anschluss in mid-March 1938, the French psychoanalyst Jacques Palacci ran into fellow analyst Heinz Kohut in front of a cafe on Währingerstrasse across from the medical school's anatomical institute. And there in the cafe window was a sign reading, quote, "No dogs or Jews allowed." 4 years prior to commencing work on Moses and monotheism, Freud had tried in a very long footnote at the beginning of chapter 4 of Civilization and Its Discontents to account for certain consequences of the adoption by, quote, "primal man," unquote, of an upright posture, including the diminished importance of what he called olfactory stimuli. Lifted up, as it were, above the powerful odors of the body's nether regions, human beings, Freud reasoned, underwent a kind of olfactory repression. He wrote, quote, "The diminution of the olfactory stimuli seems itself to be a consequence of man's raising himself from the ground, which also made his genitals, which were previously concealed, visible and in need of protection," unquote, leading both to the displacement by visual stimulation of sexually exciting smells and to a, quote, "incitement to cleanliness," unquote, that originates in an urge to get rid of the excreta, which have become disagreeable. Thus, an upright, civilized person who is not clean, who does not hide his excreta, is offending to other people. He is showing no consideration for them. Freud thought, Freud mused, Freud speculated. And this, he goes on to claim, quote, is confirmed by our strongest and commonest terms of abuse. It would be incomprehensible, too, that man should use the name of his most faithful friend in the animal world, the dog, as a term of abuse, if that creature had not incurred his contempt through two characteristics: that it is an animal whose dominant sense is that of smell, and one which has no horror of excrement, and that it is not ashamed of its sexual functions. End of quote. Nicholas Ray, who was here in this room a few weeks ago speaking with us, in one of his articles observes that this passage is, quote, patently not an advocation of man's superiority to the dog. For Freud, the dog becomes an object of contempt and an exemplum of abjection only because human civilization is constitutively invested in the tendentious abasement of the sensory organization the dog represents, end of quote. Thus, there is an almost unbearable irony in the fact that almost a decade after Freud's effort in this and other passages in Civilization and its discontents to challenge human beings' insistence on their absolute ontological difference from other animals, including even his most faithful friend, his last beloved dog, Lün, shrank from all contact with him because of the stench that emanated from his necrotizing jaw. Freud had been diagnosed with this carcinoma of the palate in 1923, and he spent the remaining 16 years of his life undergoing radiation treatment, surgical procedures, and a host of related miseries and torments, including migraines, fatigue, difficulty speaking and swallowing, insomnia, and persistent, often agonizing pain. By August 1939, the dead tissue from his jaw was emitting an odor so foul that the dog, Lün, was repelled by it and refused to be touched or even approached by Sigmund. A heart-rending experience for him, according to Ernest Jones. And his friend and doctor, Max Schur, wrote, quote, the Chow to which Freud was so attached could not tolerate the smell and could not be prodded into coming near him. When brought into the room, the dog crouched in the farthest corner. Freud knew what this meant and looked at his pet with a tragic and knowing sadness, end of quote. Of course, that tragic and knowing sadness had been intensifying for years, years during which Hitler's shadow loomed ever larger over Austria and all of Europe. How much time would any of them, including their beloved dogs, have left? Early in 1934, about to begin writing his Moses book, Freud shared with Arnold Zweig a simple reverie of a world in which he would be able simply to read what he liked in the shade of a garden, Wolf and Jofi in the grass beside me. As it turned out, of the various books Freud was able to read in the final years of his life, none better suited such a reverie than the book of his friend Marie Bonaparte. This is her book about her own dog, the dog Topsy, and the book that bears Topsy's name, Topsy the golden-haired Chow in its English translation, which Sigmund and Anna translated from French into German. Bonaparte's life had been full of canine companionship from a very early age, unlike the Freuds. She'd lived with family dogs ever since she was a young child. and later with dogs that the Freuds would come to know in the 1920s and 30s, including the dogs. Many of them have the same names. It gets very confusing. I have a detailed genealogy that I can share with you by email if you like. It's the only way to tell these dogs apart, because 3 of her dogs included dogs with the names Tattoon, as well as Cheeky, and then her favorite of all, Topsy. Never before, neither as a child, neither as a dog, nor as a grown woman, had Bonaparte been so strongly inclined to make a serious emotional investment in any of her family's dogs. But as she spent more and more time with Topsy, a kind of intimacy, as she put it, she uses that word herself, a kind of intimacy grew up between us. Then, in the spring of 1935, Topsy too developed a cancerous growth in his mouth, and that turned out to be a lymphosarcoma. Bonaparte, phenomenally wealthy and well-connected, of course, sprang into action to do everything she possibly could to keep Topsy alive, and in the process solidified this very deep and abiding connection that she had formed with Topsy in particular. And she was determined to save him at all costs. Luckily, she was one of the major benefactors of Paris's Curie Institute, and so she was able to bring her dog there for radiological treatment. Over the ensuing weeks and months, as she contemplated Topsy's fate and her own strong feelings for the dog, she started writing about their relationship, and this is what would become the manuscript of this very sweetly sentimental book about her beloved dog. And also, in between the lines, a psychodynamic meditation in its own way on interspecies attachment and loss. It was also, of course, a book about her 2 human fathers, her natural father, Prince Roland Bonaparte, who had died of cancer in 1924, and Sigmund Freud, her analytic father, who, like Topsy, was fighting cancer of the mouth. Indeed, both Freud and Topsy were suffering from malignancies on the right-hand sides of their respective oral cavities, and both were being treated radiologically. The book that Bonaparte wrote was about Topsy, but it was also very much for Sigmund Freud. Bonaparte began writing the book in March 1935 and finished it in June of the following year. And in July, Freud's doctors detected a major recurrence of Freud's cancer, which required further surgery and redoubling his already quite considerable pain. That autumn, Anna Freud's dog, Wolf, the dog who had turned her father into a dog lover as well, and who was by then at age 11 what Freud described as an old man like himself, sickened and died. As winter descended upon the stricken household, Bonaparte sent Sigmund and Anna the manuscript of Topsy, providing them both with some much-needed solace and distraction. "I love it," Sigmund Freud wrote to Marie Bonaparte in December of that year. Quote, "It is so touchingly genuine and true. It is not an analytic work, of course, but the analyst's thirst for truth and knowledge is also behind this creation. It really explains why one can love an animal like Topsy or Jofi with such extraordinary intensity, affection without ambivalence, the simplicity of a life freed from the almost unbearable conflict with civilization, the beauty of an existence complete in itself, and yet, despite all the strangeness of the organic development, there is still the feeling of an intimate affinity, of an undisputed solidarity. Often, when stroking Jofi, I have found myself humming a melody, which, tone deaf as I am, I can't help recognizing as the aria from Don Giovanni. And then Freud goes on to quote a few words he believes are his memory of the libretto of Don Giovanni, a bond of friendship binds us both, right? This famous aria, but not from Don Giovanni, which contains no such aria. But Don Giovanni was Freud's favorite of Mozart's operas. And the lines are by Mozart, just from a different place. Don Giovanni's bombastic depiction of erotic betrayal and edible violence makes this parapraxis, I think we can call it, all the more poignant, especially in light of what follows in the concluding paragraph of his letter to Bonaparte. Quote, "If you, Bonaparte, at the youthful age of 54, can't help thinking so often of death, can you wonder that at over 80, I keep brooding on whether I shall reach the age of my father and brother, or even that of my mother, tortured as I am by the conflict between the wish for rest and the dread of renewed suffering that the prolongation of life would bring, and the anticipation of sorrow at being separated from everything to which I am still attached." Perseverating on his own mortality and on the dissolution of the bonds that attached him not only to his family, friends, and beloved dogs, but also as the patriarch of psychoanalysis to his life's work, Freud seems in this letter to forget that Don Giovanni is all about the almost unbearable conflict with civilization, including, most conspicuously, patricide. As literary critic Nimrod Reitman observes, Don Giovanni dramatizes Freud's own predicament, an opera that features the inability to remember or locate the father. It discloses Freud's fear that he will become the forgotten and dislocated father of psychoanalysis, ravaged by history and promised only to oblivion. Freud was already being ravaged by pain, of course, and while he was recuperating from one of his many surgeries in 1932, Anna Freud explained in a letter to Rosenfeld that her father, quote, "can't open his mouth very well, and chewing is also still difficult," unquote. This meant, Anna explained, that, quote, "Jofi still gets most of his food," unquote. But Freud felt that he got something even better than food, namely what he considered to be the unambivalent love of his canine companion. After another grueling surgery in 1936, Freud wrote to Bonaparte, quote, "I wished you too could have seen what sympathy Freud shows me, Jofi shows me during these hellish days, as if she understood everything," unquote. But alas, Jofi too was mortal. And on January 11th, 1937, she was hospitalized for the removal of 2 ovarian cysts. And though the operation itself was successful, Jofi died from a post-operative heart attack on January 14th. Because Freud was no longer able even to contemplate life without a dog, Dorothy Burlingham brought Lün II, remember Lün II? For whom she had been caring since the Deutsch family, who had been caring for him previously, had emigrated in 1935, brought back to Freud the very next day, even as he bitterly mourned the loss of Jofi. 2 weeks later, Arnold Zweig sent his condolences to the grieving foster father, having heard from their mutual friend Max Eidingen, quote, "that you had another small operation and that Jofi is dead. The image of that beautiful, gently noble, and intelligent creature has been with me ever since. You and I are in silent agreement about our times in which terrible things are happening to people all over the globe at every moment, even now as I write this and as you read it. But that doesn't detract from the weight of loss when a beloved being, though clad in its natural coat and not a store-bought one, passes away. Jofi was a foster child as devoted to you as any human offspring, and with a wiser heart than the average human child. that she should have been taken from you at this time is a kind of barbarism on the part of fate, which since the war has been getting far too practiced with such barbarisms. Hopefully, her daughter will make up to you something of what you have lost in her mother, but it will never be quite the same. Freud's reply quietly confirmed the gravity of the loss. He said, "One cannot easily get over 7 years of intimacy." Now in his 80th year, Freud had already seen many of his friends and loved ones die. His 2 sons and their families had recently emigrated, further reducing his opportunities for intimacy. And there would be more deaths, including on February 5th, that of his dear friend Lou Andreas Salome. With the recurrence of his cancer, he also had further surgeries and excruciating pain to endure. Lün provided some much-needed comfort and companionship to keep his spirits lively. In a letter to Bonaparte, Freud wrote, "Lün has taken refuge with me after having been given a bath. If I understand her right, she wants me to thank you warmly for the greeting." And he added in this letter about her own dog, "Does Topsy realize that she is being translated?" During Freud's last few months in Vienna, as they waited for their exit visas, Sigmund and Anna worked together on translating Topsy, even as the Nazis' net closed in upon them. Freud wrote Finis Austriae in his diary on March 12th, and Hitler in Vienna 2 days later. On March 15th, their home and nearby publishing facility were ransacked by the brown shirts of the Sturmabteilung, and they confiscated Freud's passport. The following week, Anna Freud was arrested and interrogated by the Gestapo. Fearing torture, she secretly carried with her a lethal dose of barbiturate that she'd obtained from her father's doctor and friend, Max Schur, according to whom she'd already asked her father, quote, "Wouldn't it be better if we all killed ourselves?" Unquote. Amidst this horror, translating Bonaparte's book helped keep them focused on the possibility of better days. Freud's sole journal entry for the day on which Hitler returned to Vienna was Topsy translation finished. Sigmund and Anna managed to send their manuscript translation to Amsterdam, where it was published first in May 1939 as Topsy die goldenhaarige Chow, even as Bonaparte, using her royal status and her Cretian wealth, pulled strings to get them safely out of Vienna. On June 4th, Sigmund, Martha, and Anna Freud, along with their housekeeper, Paula Fichtel, their dog Lün, and another doctor, Josephine Strauss, were able to board a train to Paris, where the next morning Bonaparte met them at the station and whisked them away to her grand townhouse. That evening, they boarded the night train to Calais, where it was loaded onto the Channel ferry bound for Dover, and on June 5th, the London Sunday Dispatch ran an article on Freud's departure from Vienna to London, which bore the headline, and I love that this was the headline, "Professor Freud leaves with his dog." Not with Anna, not with Martha, his wife, not with anyone else, but with his dog. Even in England, however, further separations occurred. Knowing that Freud had safely arrived in London, Arnold Zweig wrote to him asking after everyone's well-being. Anna brought Freud's collection of antiquities. He also inquired about the canine member of the family. But he made an error, a parapraxis of his own, that he chose not to expunge, interestingly. Instead, he let it stand in the letter, presumably so that he could comment on it himself. Zweig wrote, quote, "The newspapers have already answered many questions. Your papers, your books, your collections have been saved. And Jofi, is she already... I've just noticed my strange mistake. I meant, of course, to ask about Lün. But a move such as yours is, after all, a kind of resurrection. The journey like a voyage from the land of the dead. The incursion of Egyptian darkness over Vienna like an onslaught of death. And so Jofi might well reappear also, mightn't she? Due to strict British procedures against the spread of rabies, Lün had been taken immediately from Dover to be quarantined for 6 months in North Kensington. And according to Ernest Jones, Freud missed Lün terribly, of course, and visited her there 4 days after his arrival in London and on several other occasions. In fact, Freud's first visit to the kennel on June 10th, 1938, was reported widely in the press, in the newspaper The Referee, for example, which wrote, Freud found his journey across London tiring. He seemed to find it a great effort even to walk up the path to his front door, but nothing could have kept the great scientist away from his dog friend. Lün leapt to meet him at his approach, glad recognition in every gesture. The manager of the kennel told the reporter, quote, I have never seen such happiness and understanding in an animal's eyes. He played with her, talked to her, using all sorts of little terms of endearment for fully an hour. 1 month later, a syndicated column called Animals in the News, a regular feature of syndicated newspapers, in the United States as well as in the UK, included an illustrated photograph, an illustrated paragraph on Freud's separation from Lün, with the photograph you see here under the heading, Lonely. During this time of separation, Freud was given a little Pekingese called Jumbo. But according to Jones, Jumbo attached himself almost exclusively to Paula Fichtel, who was the one who fed him. On September 16th, Martha and Paula moved into the Freud's new home at 20, new and final home, at 20 Maresfield Gardens in Hampstead in northwest London, where Sigmund and Anna joined them on September 27th. When Lün's quarantine was finally over, the dog's reunion with the famous Freud family was also widely covered in the press, including an item illustrated with Lün's photograph in London's Evening Standard, which ran beneath the headline, Professor Freud Gets His Dog Back. On Marie Bonaparte's frequent visits to the Freud's homes in both Vienna and London, she usually had at least one camera with her, and thanks to her, there are many photographs and even a handful of short home movies of Sigmund, Martha, and Anna Freud and their domestic and social life in Austria, France, and England between the years of 1937 and 1939. Bonaparte's two-part short film called Professor Freud from Vienna to London via Paris splices together scenes shot during these years, documenting their transition. In most scenes, they're surrounded by family members and friends, including Freud's sons, Ernst and Martin, and their wives, his grandsons, Lucien and Stefan, their dogs, Lün and Jumbo, Ruth Mack Brunswick, Dorothy Burlingham, Max Eidingen, Ernest Jones, Arnold Zweig, Bonaparte's husband, Prince George, her dog, Topsy, many more. What's striking about much of this footage is how relaxed and happy, even playful, everyone appears, despite the ordeals of exile and the looming specter of war and the uncertainty about the fate of other family members. The footage of Sigmund Freud often shows him playing with Lün, and in one scene, Anna Freud dances with Lün during a visit to his quarantine kennel. And there's a picture here also from the newspaper of Bonaparte and Anna retrieving Lün from the kennel and bringing him back home. Marie Bonaparte's Eugénie was also an avid cineast, and together they filmed preparations for Freud's 83rd birthday party held on May 6th in the garden at Maresfield Gardens. This was to be Freud's last birthday, of course. And this silent 5-minute film includes candid shots of Sigmund, Martha, and Anna Freud walking and talking with family members and friends, including Minna Bernays and Dorothy Burlingham, as well as Paula Fichtel, seen here tying decorative collars and messages around the necks of the two dogs, Lün and Jumbo. And in keeping with family tradition, Anna wrote what was to be the final of the birthday poems for Papa Sigmund. And this time she wrote it in English. After the birthday revels had ended, Bonaparte left London to spend part of June at her home in Saint-Tropez, where she learned from afar that her dog Tattoon, her Tattoon, not the Freud's Tattoon, had died in Paris. And on September 1st, of course, Germany invaded Poland, and 2 days later, England itself declared war. One of Freud's final wishes was to be naturalized as a British subject, but he died first on September 23rd with that hope unfulfilled. As W.H. Auden put it in his great, moving elegy for Freud, an important Jew who died in exile. A phrase that is in keeping with Freud's own fervent identification, despite his adamant irreligiosity, with what he calls his people. In the preface he wrote, for Yuda Dvasi's 1930 Hebrew translation of Totem and Taboo. And this is Freud writing in that preface. No reader of this book will find it easy to put himself in the emotional position of an author who is ignorant of the language of Holy Writ, who is completely estranged from the religion of his fathers, as well as every other religion, and who cannot take a share in nationalist ideals, but who has never yet repudiated his people, who feels that he is, in his essential nature, a Jew, and who has no desire to alter that nature. Whether that essential nature included the intergenerational unconscious transmission of animal phobias was a question taken up by another one of Freud's translators, Max Weinreich, who was also a collaborator and fellow researcher. Naomi Seidman explains that Weinreich, quote, located a certain kernel of unconscious Jewishness in the animal phobias he considered prevalent among Jewish children, unquote. Andreas Salome's 1913 remark about Freud's not caring much for cats or dogs or animals generally suggests that perhaps Freud had himself been such a child, which would help explain why it wasn't until he was in his 70s that he developed his special fondness for dogs. Ernest Jones, in his biography, makes this speculation with confidence, maybe too much confidence. He writes, like most other Jews of his generation, Freud had little contact with animals, but a couple of years before, an Alsatian dog, Wolf, had been procured to accompany his daughter Anna on her walks through the forests of the Semmering, and Freud had taken considerable interest in observing canine ways, and from then on became more and more fond of one dog after another. Later, Jones makes this remarkable comment, quote, it was only toward the end of his life that he got on to speaking terms with dogs, unquote. Whether or not it was Jones' intention, his use of the phrase speaking terms seems to wipe away in a gesture, in the estimation of many, what defines the fundamental boundary between human and non-human animals, namely the capacity for speech. The phrase speaking terms is a reminder as well of the family's tradition of having the dogs write, as it were, annual birthday poems for Sigmund Freud. As Seidman observes, it suggests a close relationship of a human kind, not only intimacy and love, but also projection, transference, and Oedipalization. The family's first dog, after all, was procured to be Anna's protector on her forest walks. Wolf was an Alsatian, or German Sheperd, a breed commonly used as police dogs, and one that would become known as Hitler's own favorite breed. They were also widely used as guard dogs in the concentration camps. In 1940, shortly after Freud's death, Hitler's Reichsernährungsministerium, pardon my pronunciation, instituted a ban on household pets for Jewish Germans, a prohibition meant both to further disenfranchise Jews while protecting animal-loving Germans, of course, and to preclude the need for the state to worry, quote, about the house pets left behind when their Jewish owners were deported, unquote. Even Wolf's name resonated with the Nazis' real and symbolic exploitation of the breed. For them, quote, the wolf was not only propaganda material, but also part of a Germanic Urwildnis, or primal wilderness, that they believed needed to be rejuvenated, unquote. For his 33rd birthday in 1922, 3 years before the Freuds welcomed Wolf in the Alsatian into their home, Hitler's fellow party members gave him a German Shepherd, which he too named Wolf. When the Volkswagen factory town was created in 1938, Hitler named it Wolfsburg, and even today, the city's seal still features the image of a golden wolf. And among the names of Hitler's widely scattered headquarters were Wolfschanze in East Prussia, Wolfschlucht in occupied Belgium, and Werwolf in the Ukraine. Meanwhile, the German-born American journalist, George Sylvester Viereck, who made a name for himself interviewing great men of the age, including Kaiser Wilhelm II, Henry Ford, Nikola Tesla, Benito Mussolini, Albert Einstein, also developed an abiding interest in psychoanalysis. And it was his complimentary and really quite insightful articles about psychoanalysis that earned him several meetings with Freud, including an extensive interview at Semmering in 1926, which was published the following year. And at one point, their discussion of man's bestial instincts leads to an exchange about dogs, in which Viereck wonders if humans would not be happier if we knew less of the processes that shapes our thoughts and emotions, and whether psychoanalysis robs us of life's enchantments in this way by tracing every feeling to its original cluster of complexes, right? We are not made, Viereck writes, more joyful by discovering that we all harbor in our hearts the savage, the criminal, and the beast. And Freud responds, what's your objection to the beasts? I prefer the society of animals infinitely to human society, and goes on to explain why. He concludes by saying, Freud that is, by saying how much more pleasant are the simple, straightforward, intense emotions of a dog wagging his tail or barking his displeasure. The emotions of the dog, Freud thoughtfully added, reminded one of heroes of antiquity. Perhaps this is the reason why we unconsciously bestow upon our canines the names of ancient heroes, such as Achilles and Hector's. At which point Viereck interjects, my own dog is a Doberman Pinscher called Ajax. At which Freud smiles at this proof of his point. But of course he would come to regret his association with Viereck, cutting ties with him in 1933, the year of Viereck's second interview with Hitler. Viereck had become, in the meantime, increasingly sympathetic with the Nazis and used his talents as a propagandist and ultimately a Nazi agent, for which he's tried and convicted in 1945. Let's Paula again. Toward the end of 1945, when Viereck was serving his prison sentence, and this is of course after Sigmund Freud's death, Anna Freud was in England, engaged in what she called an experiment in group upbringing with 6 very young German Jewish orphans whose parents had all been killed in the camps and who had ended up in Theresienstadt before the camp's liberation. These children were eventually relocated to England, ending up at Bulldog's Bank, the temporary care facility funded and staffed by former supporters and employees of the Hampstead nurseries. The 6 children, who were all then between the ages of 3 and 4, as shown here in this picture, were of course severely traumatized and exhibited a range of symptoms and maladaptive behaviors that were studied and documented by Anna Freud and many of her colleagues, including Sophie Dahn. And among the various terrors from which they suffered was an extreme fear of dogs. Anna Freud wrote, the only animal of which the children had known in Tresen was a watchdog which had belonged to one of the German guards and was said to have been feared by the whole population. Whether the children had actually seen or met this dog or merely heard about it is not known. But the fact is that all 6 children were terrified. They screamed any time a dog approached, clung to the adults, and went pale any time a dog was even in sight. But the fear of dogs was overcome eventually in almost all of these children, according to Anna Freud, who writes, by letting them handle friendly dogs. In playing with these harmless, smaller animals, the children got very excited, half afraid, half enjoying the fact that the dogs were really afraid of them. They stroked them in a somewhat aggressive manner, made noises at them, chased them while running away themselves from the dogs, all attitudes well known from children's animal play and animal fantasies. And we see here a very simple preliminary example of dog-assisted psychodynamic treatments that would become, in much later, in the mid-20th century, systematized and increasingly legitimated as the century ended. One of these children, unfortunately, never overcame his fear of dogs. Dogs remained for him a symbol of many of the inner conflicts and dangers toward which he had developed very severe neuroses. These acute fears of dogs among Holocaust survivors, children and adults, were, of course, well warranted. According to Robert Hindall, most of the eyewitness accounts of the camps mention and even focus on the guard dogs that terrorized, even mauled, and occasionally killed the camp's prisoners. Tyndall cites the testimony of a survivor of Majdanek who describes prisoners too weak or sick to work being taken to the camp kennels where they became the main course for the ravenous German shepherds. With their sharp teeth, these vicious dogs tore apart the bodies of people who had been thrown into the cages while still alive. Of course, long before the rise of Nationalsozialismus, many Jews had good reason to resent and fear dogs, which, just like wolves, had been used for millennia in anti-Semitic slurs and to police the boundary between Jew and non-Jew, from the homilies of early Christian fathers to 20th century cartoons. The metaphor of the Jewish dog and its accompanying anxiety, which pictured the dog as a threat, remained pervasive in social, intellectual, ecclesiastical, and popular contexts. Dogs themselves were trained to attack Jewish peddlers and to menace Jewish serfs. Talmudic writings and Yiddish folk tales make clear that the animal phobias that arose at the boundary between human and non-human animals were symbolically, semiotically, and phenomenologically inseparable from the boundary that separated Jews and non-Jews. Yet potentially inherited or acquired canine antipathies notwithstanding, Sigmund Freud remained devoted to his canine companions to the very end of his life, as did his daughter Anna and her partner Dorothy Burlingham for the rest of their long life together. Burlingham had accompanied the Freuds to England, where she and Anna continued their collaborative work. And after Sigmund Freud's death in 1939, the couple continued to make Maresfield's Gardens their primary home. And even after the death of Sigmund's wife, Martha, in 1951, Paula Fichtel, who had been their housekeeper since 1929, stayed on until both Dorothy and Anna had died. Burlingham in 1979, Anna Freud in 1982, thus helping in her own very important way to sustain the domestic continuity of the family. 3 women who lived under the same roof, first in Vienna and then in London for more than half a century. Their dogs were an essential part of that family continuity, and however uncertain the terms of Anna and Dorothy's intimacy might remain or appear to some, there is no such ambiguity regarding the importance of dogs in their ménage. In the year after Dorothy's death in 1979, Anna acquired a new Chow puppy and named her Jofi II, after the dog that Dorothy had given to her father in Vienna 51 years before. This brief history of dogs in the Freud's family and circle is much abbreviated. Other dog owners among the Freud's direct and collateral descendants and members of their inner circle included not only Andreas Salome, Ernest Jones, the Deutsch family, Marie Bonaparte, but also Sigmund's nephew, Harry Freud. This isn't Harry, but rather his dog. Sigmund's grandson, who of course became the extraordinary and world-famous painter, Lucien Freud, who with his companion David Dawson owned many, many whippets. He's shown here with Eli, I believe, along with his dealer, and a portrait of David Dawson in a picture taken by David Dawson, a mise en canine here. And I imagine that many of you know Lucien Freud's many, many extraordinary portraits that feature dogs, either alone or more often with human companions. Lucien's daughter, Bella Freud, right? Also a big fan of the Whippet breed, and here she's shown with her dog Pluto. Other associates include Carl Jung, pictured here with one of his many dogs. Hans Lampel, shown here with his daughter and their dog. Hilda Doolittle and her partner Breyer. Breyer's nickname was Fido, but they also had many dogs and other animals in their menagerie over the years. Thomas Mann, a good friend of Freud's, shown here with one of his many dogs, later in life, photographed by the great photographer George Platt Lyons. Heinz Hartmann, and of course, we spoke of Heinz Kohut. Here he is with his one of his pugs, Tovi. Anna Freud's colleague, Anneliese Schnurmann, Anna Freud's trainee and lifelong friend, Alice Colliner, and also some of the Freud's notable patients, including Edith Jackson and also Margareta Sonka. And these glimpses that I've given you are only beginning of the history of psychoanalysis, psychoanalysts and their dogs. From Wolff's arrival at Berggasse 19 in 1925 to 2025 and beyond. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, this history has never been comprehensively told, and needs to be. Not only to add these important relationships to the biographies of psychoanalysts and their better-known associates and patients, but also as part of the much larger story of dogs in and around psychoanalysis, including the need better to understand dogs as significant trans-species object choices in millions of human lives, as co-participants in psychoanalytic and psychotherapeutic treatments, and as non-human subjects with their own forms of conscious and unconscious experience and intersubjective relationships. So in conclusion, let me thank you all with sincere apologies to those of you who are cat people for your very kind and patient attention.
Dear Meg, thank you very much for this wonderful lecture. I have one question concerning Anna and Dorothy Burlingham. So I think Anna died in 1982.
Yep.
That, and the picture you showed us is from 1980.
Yes.
And I think, if I'm right, her partner Dorothy died in that year.
Dorothy died in 1979.
Okay.
Yeah,
And when did she got the
she got the dog as a way of
replacement?
not replacement,
Not,
of course, but to keep her company in her grief after Dorothy.
Okay,
death.
so
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So that she
And then
brought
she
a dog.
herself died just a couple of years later.
2 years. Yeah.
Yeah. Paula Fichtel survived them all.
Yes, and she came back to Salzburg.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much for this wonderful.
Of course. Of course, I'm very interested in the impression that going into such detail about this history and the history of these relationships, and even calling them relationships, has on listeners, including those of you who might be more skeptical. I'm also very curious about anecdotes of psychoanalysts and dogs that I might not yet know about. I'm always collecting. And there are archives all over the world that have been very helpful, since I can't travel to them all, to, in some cases, scan materials, even photographs for me. This is an ongoing process. I'm still learning more and more about the extent and number of these relationships. Yeah. Also, always very interested to hear from people about their own relationships with dogs, especially if you ever think about them or tend to understand them in psychodynamic terms. If you ever wonder about the subjectivity of your companion animal, or see signs of the subjectivity of your companion animal, and how you read those signs.
So maybe it would be good also to do to think about that the relationship between, because you mentioned cat people.
Yes.
But you are a dog.
I myself, yes, have always been. Yeah. I'm also allergic to cats. There's a traumatic story behind that, which I won't share with you. Yes, I lost the dog of my heart 10 years ago. And I mean, I've had various dogs in my life and been around various dogs, but the one true dog of my heart was Robbie, and I grieve for him every day still. He meant more to me than almost every other person in my life. Truly. And that's not to denigrate the people, but to emphasize how important my relationship with him was.
Something like an archetype, because you said it, the human being's best friend is the dog.
Yeah. Yeah, right. I mean, it's a cultural cliche, right? And, and the presumption of loyalty and fidelity that humans bring to dogs is often, a way of enacting forms of cruelty toward them. So, you know, I don't want to be sentimental about this, right? I mean, and there are many other kinds of relationships that humans have with dogs, right? And many other experiences within otherwise good relationships, you know, because they're such important relationships, right? I mean, Freud said, oh, they're not, you know, there's no ambivalence. And, you know, I know he didn't believe that himself, and it's, of course, patently untrue. No one could speak as Freud does about the deep love and affection and compare the loss of his dog to the loss of his grandson as Freud does if he didn't understand that this was a real relationship and therefore inevitably full of ambivalence, as all love is. But he wanted so much to, as so many of us do, to purge those relationships of the negativity that is part of any attachment, whether it's to another human being or to a companion animal. And it's, you know, so you know, it's important to. Yeah, please. I'm just talking because I didn't see any hands go up. I'm just trying to fill space here. I'd rather hear from you now.
Sorry. Thank you so much for your talk. I was wondering, were there any major moments where you found either Freud or other members of the Freud family or other psychoanalysts speak more psychoanalytically about humans' relationship with dogs, or are you pulling with your book? Are you referencing more so things through correspondence and more anecdotal moments, or is there any core kind of psychoanalytic areas where you're talking about the relationship
psychoanalytic
between, psychoanalytic writings, or anywhere where you found people talking about that?
Yeah, most of which is very recent, because it's only very recently that within, say, the last 2-3 decades, there's been an absolute explosion in research on dogs across the sciences. And that has taught us things about dogs that we never knew before, and showed us that things we thought we knew about dogs were completely wrong. And as was the case 100 years ago, psychoanalysts today like to have some psychoanalytic legitimation to bolster, themselves against the skepticism that so many others bring still to psychoanalysis. And that's allowed or made more psychoanalysts feel comfortable about writing and publishing writing about their relationships with dogs, whether it's personal relationships with their companion animals and or their use of dogs as co-therapists. Even the term veterinary psychiatry is only about 3 or 4 years old, right? Veterinarians and ethologists and other folks who study animals or animal-human relationships weren't even willing to call veterinary behavioral science psychiatry until just a few years ago. Publicly, that is, right? But yes, in recent years, there's been a lot of writing by psychoanalysts, again, about their companion animals and clinical writing about using dogs in psychodynamic, not behavioral, cognitive behavioral treatment, but psychodynamic treatment of human patients with canine co-therapists. And I hope more and more will continue to do so as it becomes, more okay, right? As the skepticism and trivialization, right, that many people react with wane, right? As they undoubtedly will.
Is there any more question? Okay, Max, thank you very, very much. It was, so to release you, thank you very much for your interest in coming.